solo traveler disappeared in 2009. 16 years later, flight manifest recovered indicates. The dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light. The only movement in the sterile silence of the National Archives Annex. Ilara's breath was a small, tight knot in her chest. For 16 years, it had been a ghost limb, this feeling an ache for a brother who had simply vanished. Julian, with his wild hair and a laugh that could shatter glass, had walked into the humid embrace of the Colombian Amazon in the summer of 2009 and had never walked out. He was a solo traveler, a chaser of horizons, and the official story was as simple as it was brutal. The jungle had taken him. A slip, a snake, a wrong turn, no body, no trace, just a ghost. But ghosts leave whispers. And Ilara had followed them here, to this climate-controlled tomb of forgotten paper. Chasing a whisper that had turned into a scream. It was a long shot, an obsession her therapist called a maladaptive coping mechanism. The airline Aries, de Colombia, had gone bankrupt in 2011, its assets scattered, its records a bureaucratic nightmare. But a recent data recovery initiative, a footnote in an aviation trade journal, had mentioned a cache of salvaged flight manifests from the defunct airline's regional hub in Leticia. It was a digital needle in a continent-sized haystack. For 3 months, Ilara had filed requests, battled with clerks, and pulled on the thread of her press credentials until something, miraculously, gave way. And now, here it was. A dot matrix printout, the paper jaundiced and brittle with age. August 14, 2009. Flight 714, Leticia to Bogota. A routine puddle jumper, a flight Julian was never supposed to be on. His itinerary, the one tacked to her corkboard for over a decade, had him booked on a flight 2 days later. Her finger, trembling, traced the columns of faded names. Garcia, M.R. Rojas, Paseo Castillo y. The ink was faint, bleeding at the edges. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. And then she saw it. The name wasn't under Vance, her brother's surname. It was tucked away, almost hidden, halfway down the second column. Blackwell, J. The breath she'd been holding escaped in a ragged hollow sound that was too loud in the crushing quiet. Blackwell. It was their mother's maiden name. A name Julian sometimes used for silly reservations, a nod to their shared history, a private joke. But this was no joke. This was a flight manifest, an official document. And next to the name, the passport number. She knew it by heart, the same way she knew her own. The numbers swam before her eyes, blurring through a sudden, hot film of tears. It was his. But that wasn't the shock. The shock was the name listed directly below his. Reyes, Marcus. The world tilted on its axis. The quiet room, the dancing dust motes, the smell of aging paper, all dissolved into a roar of white noise. Marcos Reyes and Julian is best friend. His shadow, his brother, in all but blood since they were children. The man who had organized the search parties. The man who had delivered the eulogy at the empty casket funeral. His voice choked with a grief so profound, so utterly convincing, that it had become a part of their family's tragic lore. Marcus, who had held Ilara's hand as she sobbed, whispering, "We'll find him, Elle. I swear to you, we'll find him." He was supposed to have been in Medellin on business that week. He'd shown them the plane tickets, the hotel receipts. A rock-solid alibi, confirmed and reconfirmed by the indifferent local police. An alibi that had stood, unbreached, for 16 years. But this manifest, this brittle, forgotten piece of paper said otherwise. It said that on August 14, 2009, Marcus Reyes and Julian Vance, traveling under a pseudonym, had been on the same flight. A flight that had landed safely in Bogota. A flight that proved Julian hadn't died in the jungle at all. He had boarded a plane, and Marcus was with him. The manifest wasn't just a clue, it was a detonation. It blew a hole through 16 years of accepted reality. The story they had all clung to, the tragic, romantic narrative of the lost adventurer, was a lie. A carefully constructed, meticulously maintained lie. A cold dread, sharp and exquisitely painful, pierced through the shock. It was the memory of Marcus's eyes at the funeral. They hadn't just been filled with grief. Ilara saw it now, in the unforgiving clarity of this new reality. There had been something else there, something she had mistaken for sorrowful intensity. It was fear, a deep, abyssal fear. And beneath that, a flicker of something she couldn't name then, but could name now. Triumph. The official report had been so simple. Julian had gone for a 3-day trek with a local guide. The guide returned alone, claiming Julian had insisted on staying an extra night at a remote indigenous village, promising to catch up. He never did. The guide was questioned, released. The search turned up nothing but his rain-shredded backpack, found weeks later near a riverbank miles from his supposed route. It was a clean narrative. To clean. Now, the clean lines of the story bled into a grotesque new shape. If Julian had left the jungle, why the lie? Why the elaborate charade of a search? Why would Marcus, his closest friend, orchestrate such a deception? The questions came in a torrent, each one colder and more terrifying than the last. Julian hadn't just disappeared. He had been disappeared. Her phone felt alien in her hand, heavy and cold. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over Marcus's name. He was no longer the grieving friend. He was a monster wearing a familiar face. A man who had built a life, a career, a sterling reputation on the foundations of a secret so profound it had consumed her family. He was a titan of industry now, a philanthropist whose name was carved onto the walls of museums and hospitals. The Marcus of today was a world away from the broke, ambitious young man who had followed Julian to South America. Her finger shook as she tapped the screen. The call connected. One ring. To Ilara. Is everything all right? His voice was the same. Rich, warm, laced with a manufactured concern that now sounded like acid in her ear. She couldn't speak. The words were lodged in her throat, a shard of glass. Ilara, can you hear me? She looked at the manifest at the two names sitting side by side, a silent testament to a shared, secret journey. She thought of Julian's laugh, of the way he'd throw his head back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. She thought of the 16 years of birthdays he'd missed, the holidays that were just hollowed-out days on a calendar. The gaping, unfillable hole he'd left in their lives, a hole that Marcus had pretended to help them paper over, all while knowing its true, horrifying dimensions. I know, she whispered, the words finally breaking free, raw and broken. I know you were with him. There was a pause. Not of confusion, not of surprise. It was the pause of a chess player whose opponent has just made an unexpected, catastrophic move. The silence stretched, thick with 16 years of unspoken truths. When he finally spoke, the warmth was gone. His voice was flat, metallic. A machine. You don't know anything. Flight 714, she said, her own voice gaining a sliver of strength from the cold terror in his. Letitia to Bogota. August 14th. You were sitting right next to him, Marcus. You were sitting right next to my brother. The line went dead. Ilara stared at the phone, then back at the manifest. The dust motes no longer looked like dancing particles of light. They looked like ashes. The ashes of a life, of a truth she had been denied for almost 2 decades. The silence of the archive was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. It was the silence of a grave. And the cliffhanger wasn't what would happen next. It was the horrifying, gut-wrenching realization of what had already been done. The lie wasn't the mystery. The lie was the answer. And she had just told the liar that she knew. The weight of it settled on her, a physical pressure. She was no longer just a grieving sister. She was a witness. And in the cold, sterile quiet of the archive, she understood with chilling certainty that she had just made herself a target. The man on the other end of the line had kept this secret for 16 years. He wouldn't let a piece of paper, and the woman holding it, destroy him now. The jungle hadn't taken her brother, Marcus had, and now, he knew she was coming for him. The hunt had begun. Ilara sank into the hard plastic chair. The flimsy manifests clutched in her hand like a holy relic. Her mind, a maelstrom of shock and grief, began to clear, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury. She looked at the two names again, Blackwell, J, and Reyes, M. They weren't just entries on a list. They were the beginning and the end of a story she had been living from the wrong side of the curtain. She remembered Julian in the months before he left. He'd been different, quieter. A shadow had passed over his usual sun-drenched optimism. He'd lost a staggering amount of money in a tech startup that had gone belly up, a venture he'd launched with Marcus. Julian had shouldered the public failure, the bankruptcy, protecting Marcus's name, as he always did. Marcus has more to lose, Julian had told her, a strange, wary resignation in his voice. He's the one with the real ambition. I'm just me. At the time, she'd seen it as loyalty. Now, it looked like a prelude to a sacrifice. And Marcus, he had emerged from that same failure, unscathed. More than unscathed, while Julian was planning his escape to the Amazon, a trip he'd framed as a soul-searching journey to get his head straight. Marcus had been laying the groundwork for a new empire. He had secured funding from a mysterious overseas investor, launching the company that would become Reyes Global, a multi-billion-dollar logistics and private security conglomerate. He'd risen from the ashes of their shared failure like a phoenix, while Julian had simply become ash. The pieces began to click into place, each one a tiny hammer blow against her heart. The trip, the financial ruin, Julian's uncharacteristic despair, Marcus's meteoric rise. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a transaction. She thought about the hidden witness, a concept that had felt abstract until this very moment. Who else knew? Who checked them in at that dusty Letitia airport? Who piloted the plane? Who saw two men, one desperate, one determined, board a flight to a new reality? Somewhere out there, there was someone else who knew that the official story was a lie. A clerk, a flight attendant, a baggage handler, a loose thread in the tapestry of Marcus's deception. For 16 years, that thread had held, but now, she had a pair of scissors. The stark reality of her situation settled in. Marcus wasn't just a successful businessman. Reyes Global wasn't just a logistics company. Its private security division was a mercenary force, operating in the gray zones of international law, notorious for its ruthless efficiency. They were the ones who made problems disappear. Just like Julian, a wave of nausea rolled through her. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a sickness in her gut. The power imbalance was cosmic. He was a king in a glass castle, surrounded by lawyers and soldiers. She was a freelance journalist with a crumbling apartment and a sixth obsession, and a piece of paper she had to get out of the archive. The walls felt like they were closing in, the silence buzzing with threats. She took a photo of the manifest with her phone, her hands shaking so badly, the first two attempts were a blur. She then, carefully, reverently, folded the original and slipped it into an inner pocket of her jacket. The brittle paper in protest, it felt like carrying a bomb dot. As she walked out of the building and into the blinding late afternoon sun, the world looked different. The people rushing by on the sidewalk, lost in their own lives, seemed fragile, oblivious. They lived in a world where stories made sense, where friends didn't erase friends, where grief had a finality. Her world had just been shattered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from an unknown number. "You're making a mistake." Just for words, no name, no threat. But the menace was absolute. It was a warning shot. He was watching her. He knew where she was. The dread she'd felt in the archive solidified into pure, undiluted terror. He had been one step ahead of her for 16 years. He was already moving his pieces on the board. She broke into a run, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't know where she was going. Away, anywhere. But there was no away. The ghost of her brother was no longer a gentle, sorrowful presence. He was a screaming phantom, demanding justice. And Marcus Reyes, the man who had built an empire on his bones, was no longer a distant, powerful figure. He was an immediate, existential threat. The cliffhanger wasn't just a question of truth. It was a question of survival. The first time Alara met Marcus Reyes, he was all scraped knees and bravado, a 10-year-old trying to teach her 7-year-old brother, Julian, how to climb the ancient oak tree that dominated their backyard. Julian, ever the cautious one, was hesitating on the lowest branch. Marcus, already halfway up, had shimmied onto a thick limb and was grinning down. A gap-toothed evangelist of boyhood recklessness. "It's easy, Jules. Don't be a baby. Just don't look down." Even then, there was a stark difference between them. Julian was a dreamer, a boy whose pockets were filled with smooth stones, strange leaves, and scribbled poems. His heart was an open book. Marcus was a strategist. His pockets were empty, but his eyes were full, constantly assessing, calculating. He wasn't just climbing a tree, he was conquering it. He saw the world not as a place of wonder, but as a series of obstacles to be overcome. Their friendship was a strange alchemy. Marcus's ambition gave Julian's dreams a practical edge, a sense of possibility. Julian's gentleness sanded down Marcus's rougher, more ruthless corners. They were two halves of a whole. "You're my brother, Jules," Marcus would say, slinging an arm around Julian's shoulder. "More than my real one." It was a bond forged in the crucible of a shared fractured childhood. Julian and Ellora's father was a gentle, absent-minded professor. Their mother, a loving but anxious woman who saw danger in every shadow. Marcus's home was a different kind of broken. His father was a hard, unforgiving man who measured his son's worth in victories and dollar signs. His mother was a ghost, in her own home, medicated into a placid stupor. The Vance house, with its scent of baking bread and piles of books, became Marcus's sanctuary. He wasn't just Julian's friend, he was a graft onto their family tree, as they grew into men. The dynamic held, but the stakes changed. Julian, the victim of their story, became an artist, a photographer who chased light and beauty in the forgotten corners of the world. His photographs weren't just images, they were poems. A wrinkled hand in a market in Marrakesh, a child's laugh silhouetted against a Thai sunset, the stark, lonely beauty of a Patagonian glacier. He was financially inept, perpetually broke, but rich in a currency Marcus could never understand. Marcus, the antagonist, followed the path his father had beaten for him: business school, an internship at a soulless investment bank, a relentless single-minded climb up the corporate ladder. He wore tailored suits like armor and wielded ambition like a weapon. He was handsome, charismatic, and utterly hollow inside. The brokenness of his past hadn't been healed. It had been weaponized. He collected successes, deals, cars, women like trophies, each one a validation against his father's corrosive disapproval. Yet, he still orbited Julian, drawn to the authenticity he himself lacked. He was the silent partner in Julian's art gallery, the one who fronted the money for his trips. It was a patronage that, in hindsight, looked more like ownership. "I'm investing in you, buddy," he'd say, a phrase that now curdled in Elara's memory. The hidden witness was a man named Hector Vargas. In 2009, Hector was a 22-year-old check-in agent for Aires de Colombia at the Alfredo Vasquez Cobo International Airport in Leticia. It was a sweltering, dead-end job, in a town that was a gateway to nowhere. Hector's past was a story of small-time failures. He'd dropped out of university, failed as a fisherman, and was drowning in debt from a brother's medical bills. His emotional wound was a constant gnawing anxiety, a fear of sinking so deep he'd never surface. He saw the world through a lens of desperation, every interaction a potential opportunity or a threat. On the afternoon of August 14, 2009, two Americans approached his counter. One was tense, pale, his eyes darting around the small, chaotic terminal, as if expecting an attack. He looked hunted. That was Julian. The other was calm, collected. His expensive watch a stark contrast to the humidity-stained surroundings. That was Marcus. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and an aura of absolute authority. Marcus did all the talking. He slid two passports across the counter. The names didn't match the men. Not exactly. The hunted one's passport read Julian Vance, but the ticket was for Jay Blackwell. The calm one's passport read Marcus Reyes, and so did his ticket. "We need to make a change," Marcus had said, his Spanish fluent but sterile. He placed a thick envelope on the counter. Through the thin paper, Hector could see the unmistakable green of American $100 bills. My friend, Mr. Blackwell, has had a change of heart. He will not be flying today. However, his associate, he gestured vaguely to a man standing in the shadows near the entrance. A man Hector hadn't noticed before will be taking his place. His name is also J. Blackwell. A coincidence? It was absurd. A lie so blatant. It was insulting. But the envelope was heavy. It was more money than Hector made in a year. It was enough to pay off his brother's debts, to get his family out from under the thumb of the local loan shark. And we will need you to forget Mr. Vance was ever here, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He's gone for a walk. Into the jungle. Perhaps he'll be back. Perhaps not. It's a dangerous place. He pushed the envelope forward. This is a memory aid. To help you remember the correct story. Hector's heart was pounding. This wasn't just a bribe, it was something darker. He looked at Julian, who stood silent, his face a mask of misery. He looked like a man being led to his own execution. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. And in that moment, Hector saw a silent, desperate plea. Help me. But Hector's own fear was a louder scream. The loan shark wasn't a man who made idle threats. He thought of his mother, of his sister. He thought of the crushing weight of his life. He looked back at Marcus, at the cold reptilian certainty in his eyes. This was not a man you said no to. So Hector did it. He took the money. He issued a new boarding pass for the phantom Mr. Blackwell, and kept the original manifest showing Julian's intended name. He watched as Marcus and the silent, shadowy associate walked towards the gate. He watched as Julian was led, not onto the plane, but out of the terminal, towards a waiting black SUV parked on the tarmac, a vehicle that had no business being there. He saw the brief, violent struggle as Julian was forced into the car. Then it drove away, not towards the town, but towards the dense, impenetrable wall of green that bordered the airport. Hector turned back to his computer, his hands shaking. He voided Julian Vance's record. He entered the name J. Blackwell. He created a ghost. He told himself it was just business. He told himself it was none of his business. But the image of Julian's pleading eyes, and the sound of the car door slamming shut, would become the ghosts that haunted his own life for the next 16 years. He had been a witness, not just to a conspiracy, but to an abduction, and his silence, purchased for a few $1,000s, had been the final nail in Julian Vance's coffin. Ilara, sitting in her darkened apartment with the manifest on her coffee table, knew none of this. But she knew the characters. She knew Julian's gentle soul, his tendency to trust, his vulnerability in the face of Marcus's overwhelming ambition. She knew Marcus, the boy who had to win at everything, the man who saw people as assets or liabilities, a brother who had become a liability. She pulled out a box of old photographs. There they were, Julian and Marcus, arms slung around each other on a beach, grinning at the camera. Two boys on the cusp of manhood, their futures stretching out before them. But the smiles were different. Julian's was open, genuine. Marcus's was a performance. It was the smile of a predator who had already chosen his prey. The photo was from the summer before they went to Colombia. The summer, their startup, had imploded. Julian had lost everything. But Marcus, she now realized, had lost nothing. He had simply liquidated his oldest asset. She remembered a conversation. A fight she'd overheard between them just before the trip. She'd been in the kitchen, and they were in the living room, their voices sharp. You can't just walk away from this, Marcus. People got hurt. People lost their homes. Julian's voice was filled with anguish. Business is business. Jules, Marcus's reply was cold, dismissive. There's always collateral damage. You're too soft. You always have been. That's why you'll always be a dreamer, and I'll be the one who owns the world. I'd rather be a dreamer than a monster. Julian had shot back. A monster. That's what her brother had called him. And she hadn't understood. She'd dismissed it as the melodrama of a failed business, the lashing out of a wounded ego. Now, the word echoed in the silent apartment with the force of prophecy. Julian had seen the monster long before anyone else. He had seen the darkness coiled behind the charismatic smile, the ambition that had no moral compass. And he had paid the price for that knowledge. The narrative was no longer about a lost traveler. It was about a brotherhood betrayed, a victim who saw the truth too late, an antagonist who would kill to protect his lies, and a witness, somewhere in the sweltering humidity of the past, who held the key. Ilara's mission was no longer just to find out what happened to her brother. It was to unmask the monster he had tried to warn her about. She wasn't just seeking closure, she was seeking justice. And she would tear down Marcus Reyes's world, brick by bloody brick, to get it. The first move was Marcus's. It was brutal, swift, and designed to cripple her. The day after her call, Ilara woke up to an email from the editor of the online magazine she freelanced for. Her contract was terminated, effective immediately. No reason was given. An hour later, a second email. The investigative journalism grant she had been awarded, the one that was supposed to keep her afloat for the next 6 months, had been rescinded. The foundation cited a revaluation of project priorities. Then her landlord called. It was an issue with her lease. She was being evicted. It was a systematic dismantling of her life, executed with the cold, impersonal precision of a drone strike. She could feel Marcus's fingerprints all over it. He wasn't just a man. He was an institution, his tentacles wrapped around finance, media, real estate. He was showing her, with terrifying efficiency, how small she was, how easily he could crush her. The fear was a physical presence, a cold knot in her stomach. The anonymous text messages continued, each one a small psychological torture. They found his backpack, empty. Another. The jungle is good at keeping secrets. He was toying with her, reminding her that he controlled the narrative, the one that had held for 16 years. But fear, she discovered, was a crucible. It burned away the trivialities, the hesitations. It left behind a core of pure, unadulterated rage. He thought he could intimidate her, silence her with money and power. He had mistaken her grief for weakness. He had forgotten that she was Julian's sister. She had his stubbornness, his refusal to bow to bullies. She needed to escalate. The manifest was a bombshell, but it was just a piece of paper. Marcus could claim it was a forgery, a clerical error. She needed more. She needed the witness. Hector Vargas. Finding him was a nightmare. His name wasn't on any public records connected to the airline. Ida's the Colombia's employee files were a black hole. She spent days cross-referencing social media, old news articles, anything that could link a name to that airport in 2009. It was like searching for a ghost in a graveyard of data. Her apartment, now a landscape of packing boxes, felt like a besieged outpost. She barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every siren in the distance, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She was living on coffee and adrenaline. Her world shrunk to the blue glow of her laptop screen. Finally, a breakthrough. A faded photograph from a 2010 news article about the airline's impending bankruptcy. It showed a group of disgruntled employees protesting outside the Bogotá office. In the background, a young man with haunted eyes held a sign that read, "They stole our futures." A caption listed some of the names. One of them was Hector Vargas. It was him. The face was younger, thinner, but the eyes were the same ones she had imagined. The eyes of a man burdened by a terrible secret. From there, the trail became easier to follow. A digital breadcrumb here, another there. He had moved to Miami, worked a series of low-wage security jobs, and currently lived in a small rundown apartment in Little Havana. Ilara booked a flight. She sold her camera, her most prized possession after Julian's old Nikon, to pay for the ticket. As she packed her bag, a new text message arrived. This one was different. It wasn't a taunt. It was a picture. A photo of her, taken from across the street, standing in her apartment window. Her blood ran cold. He wasn't just watching her communications, he was physically watching her. The escalating conflict was no longer a war of information. It had become dangerously real. The flight to Miami was agony. Every passenger seemed like a potential threat. Every moment of turbulence felt like a premonition. When she landed, the humid, cloying air of the city felt like the jungle itself, thick with secrets and unseen dangers. Hector Vargas lived in a peeling pastel yellow apartment building that smelled of fried plantains and desperation. When she knocked on his door, he opened at a crack, his face obscured by a security chain. He was older now, his hair graying at the temples, his face etched with the fine lines of a long-held anxiety. "Hector Vargas?" she asked, her voice steadier. Then she felt, "Who's asking?" His voice was hoarse, laced with suspicion. "My name is Ilara Vance. My brother, Julian Vance, disappeared in Colombia in 2009. I think you know what happened to him." The blood drained from his face. He tried to slam the door, but she was ready. She jammed her foot in the opening. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I just want to know the truth. You were there. You were at the check-in counter. I know you were." His eyes, wide with panic, darted past her, scanning the street behind her. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "You don't understand. This man, he's not just a man, he's the devil." "Marcus Reyes," she said, the name like a curse on her lips. Hector flinched as if struck. "You have to go now. He has eyes everywhere. If he knows you found me." The door to the adjacent apartment opened. A large, muscular man with a flat, expressionless face stepped into the hallway. He wasn't a neighbor. He wore a crisp, black polo shirt with no logo, but it screamed private security. He looked at Ilara, then at Hector, and a slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Everything all right here, Hector?" the man asked, his voice a low rumble. Hector's face was a mask of pure terror. "Everything is fine, Carlos," he stammered. "This woman, she is lost. I was just giving her directions." Carlos's gaze settled on Ilara. It was a predator's gaze, utterly devoid of emotion. "Is that right? You look a little far from home." He took a step towards her. "Maybe I can help you find your way." This was it, the escalation she had feared. Marcus hadn't just been watching her. He had anticipated her. He had a man watching his only loose end. The witness wasn't just scared, he was a prisoner. "I'm fine," Ilara said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. "I don't think you are," Carlos said, his smile widening. He lunged, his hand shooting out to grab. Her arm, adrenaline, pure and potent, surged through her. She ducked under his arm, spun around, and ran. She clattered down the concrete steps, her heart hammering in her ears. She could hear his heavy footsteps behind her, gaining on her. She burst out onto the street, into the blinding sunlight, and didn't look back. She ran, weaving through pedestrians, her lungs burning. The sound of Carlos's pursuit, a drumbeat of doom. She managed to lose him in the crowded chaos of Calle Ocho, ducking into a small bakery, her body trembling, her mind reeling. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just Marcus. It was an entire system he had built to protect his secret. She had found the witness, but in doing so, she had led the wolf right to his door. She had not only put herself in mortal danger, but she had likely just signed Hector Vargas's death warrant. She slumped onto a chair, gasping for breath, the smell of sweet Cuban coffee doing nothing to calm her frayed nerves. Her phone buzzed. Another text. "Some ghosts should stay buried. Your next." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just threatening her, he was taking pleasure in her terror. The conflict had escalated beyond her wildest fears. Marcus wasn't just defending himself anymore, he was hunting her. And he was enjoying it. The game had changed. This wasn't about uncovering a 16-year-old crime. This was about surviving. The next 16 hours, she looked out at the bustling street, at the vibrant life of the city, and felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. She was fighting a monster with an army, and she had just led him to his one vulnerability. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. What would he do to protect himself now? The answer was terrifyingly simple. anything. For 3 days, Alara hid. She moved from a cheap motel to an even cheaper one, paying in cash, using a burner phone. The terror was a constant companion, a metallic taste in her mouth. She was trapped in a city that felt like a cage, haunted by the image of Hector's panicked face and the cold, dead eyes of the man named Carlos. She had failed. She had exposed the one person who could corroborate her story, and in doing so, had probably sealed his fate, and her own. The weight of her failure was crushing, a physical ache that settled deep in her bones. She was ready to give up, to run, to disappear herself. Then, on the 4th night, an email arrived on her encrypted account. The sender was anonymous. The subject line was a single word, Letitia. Her heart stopped. With trembling hands, she opened it. There was no text, only an attached audio file. AAC. Its name was a random string of numbers and letters. It was a small file, barely a megabyte. It could be anything, a virus, a trap. She hesitated for a long moment, her cursor hovering over the download button. The fear was a physical barrier, a wall of what-ifs. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting Marcus win, letting Julian's memory be a lie forever, was unthinkable. She clicked. The file downloaded in seconds. She plugged in her headphones, the cheap foam pressing against her ears, and hit play. At first, there was only static, a thick, hissing sound, like a radio tuned between stations. Then, through the noise, a voice, faint, distorted, but recognizable. It was Hector Vargas. Don't understand. You said he was just leaving. You said. His voice was thin, reedy with fear. Then another voice, this one clear, powerful, and utterly chilling. It was Marcus. I said I was handling it, and I am. The arrangement has changed. The audio quality shifted, as if a recording device had been moved closer. The static lessened. The conversation became terrifyingly clear. It was a hidden recording. Hector must have made it. What arrangement? Hector's voice was barely a whisper. Where are you taking him? That's not the terminal. He's a liability, Marcus said, his voice cold as a morgue slab. He was going to talk. He found out about the offshore accounts. The real ones. The ones the investors don't know about. He was going to expose everything. The idiot. He thought it was his company, too. He thought we were partners. A third voice cut in, rougher, with a thick accent. It must have been the man from the SUV, the shadow from the airport. He's getting agitated, boss. Then sedate him, Marcus snapped. There was a sound of a struggle, a muffled cry that tore through Elare's soul. It was Julian's voice. Marcus, no, don't do this, please. It was the sound of ultimate betrayal, the plea of a man to his brother, his friend. As the world fell out from under him. You always were too soft, Jules. Marcus's voice was conversational, almost gentle, which made the words infinitely more monstrous. I told you that some of us are built to build empires. Others are just collateral damage. Then, a sickeningly soft sound, a thud, and silence. Julian's voice was gone. What did you do? Hector's voice was a strangled gasp. Secured our future, Hector, Marcus said. And you're a part of that future now. You're an accessory. You took the money. You changed the manifest. You helped me create a ghost. So you will keep your mouth shut. You will remember the story. The American went for a walk in the jungle. It's a sad story, but it's the only one. Do you understand me? Yes. Hector whispered. The word was hollow, the sound of a soul being crushed. Good, Marcus said, because the jungle is good at keeping secrets, and so are we. The recording ended. There was only the hiss of static, then silence. Elara ripped the headphones from her ears, a strangled sob escaping her lips. She stumbled to the bathroom, and was violently sick. The audio file wasn't just a clue, it was a confession. It was the entire conspiracy, laid bare in all its calculated cruelty. Julian hadn't just been disappeared, he'd been executed, murdered by his best friend for money. The startup failure, the lost funds, it was all a lie. Marcus had stolen the money, millions of it, and hidden it offshore. Julian, with his inconvenient conscience, had discovered the theft and was going to expose him. The trip to Colombia wasn't a soul-searching journey, it was a lure. A trap. The full monstrous picture bloomed in her mind. Marcus had brought Julian to the most remote place he could think of, a place where people vanished all the time. He had fabricated the story of the jungle trek, paid off the local guide, and created a 16-year lie that was as vast and impenetrable as the Amazon itself. He hadn't just killed his friend, he had erased him, replacing the real, breathing man with a tragic myth. The grief was a physical blow, doubling her over. She wept, not just for the brother she had lost, but for the man she now knew he had been in those final moments. Terrified, betrayed, and utterly alone. She mourned the 16 years she had spent grieving the wrong death, believing the wrong story. The injustice of it was a fire in her veins, burning away the tears, hardening her grief into a diamond-hard resolve. The plot twist wasn't just that Marcus was a killer. The twist was that she now held the murder weapon. This recording changed everything. It wasn't her word against his anymore. It was his own words, his own voice, that would condemn him. The stakes had shifted from a personal quest for truth to a public demand for justice. This wasn't a private scandal. This was a crime that needed to be exposed to the world. She thought of Hector. He had sent her the recording. It was an act of desperate courage. By sending it, he had signed his own death warrant. If Marcus ever found out, he had passed the torch to her, the final, explosive piece of evidence. He was trusting her to use it, to do what he had been too afraid to do for 16 years. Her fear was gone. In its place was a chilling clarity. She knew what she had to do. Hiding was no longer an option. Running was no longer an option. Marcus Reyes had built an empire on her brother's bones. It was time to bring it all crashing down. She looked at her laptop, at the audio file that held the truth. The tension in the room was electric. It was the feeling before a lightning strike. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't a grieving sister cowering in a motel room. She was an executioner. And she was about to bring the blade down on the man who had stolen her brother's life. Her plan began to form, audacious and terrifying. A quiet leak to the press wouldn't be enough. Marcus would bury it, dismiss it as a deepfake, a smear campaign. Justice couldn't be a press release. It had to be a spectacle. It had to be undeniable, public, and catastrophic. It had to be cinematic. Marcus was hosting his annual Future Founders Charity Gala in New York in 2 days. It was the crown jewel of his philanthropic efforts, a star-studded event that celebrated his public image as a benevolent corporate titan. The press would be there. The city's elite would be there. It was a stage he had built for his own glory. She would use his stage to hang him. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She sent the audio file to a trusted contact, a brilliant audio engineer she had worked with years ago, with a single instruction: clean this up, make every word crystal clear, and make it loud. Then she booked a flight to New York. The huntress was done hiding. She was going into the lion's den, not with a spear, but with a mirror. A mirror that would show the monster to the entire world. The maximum tension wasn't in the waiting. It was in the cold, calm certainty of the coming storm. A storm that would finally, after 16 long years, wash away the lies and reveal the truth buried beneath. The ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was a galaxy of manufactured starlight. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of black ties. And designer gowns? The air hummed with the quiet, confident chatter of the city's power brokers. A symphony of wealth and influence. On a raised dais at the far end of the room, Marcus Reyes stood at a podium, bathed in a soft, forgiving spotlight. He was in his element, a king addressing his court. He looked magnificent, his custom-tailored tuxedo fitting him like a second skin, his face a mask of earnest benevolence. He was speaking about opportunity, about legacy, about building a better future. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost sublime. Alara stood at the back of the room, invisible. She was dressed as a waitress, a uniform she had acquired for $300 from a disgruntled hotel employee she'd found on Craigslist. Her hair was tucked under a severe black wig, her face altered with subtle makeup. She was just another servant, a ghost in the machine of the grand event. In her pocket, her phone was connected to a small, powerful Bluetooth speaker she had hidden earlier that day behind a curtain near the main stage. Her heart was a cold, steady drum against her ribs. This was it, the cinematic payoff. Her audio engineer had worked a miracle. The cleaned-up recording was terrifyingly clear. Julian's final, desperate plea, Marcus's cold-blooded pronouncement, it was all there, stripped of static, ready for its debut. She watched Marcus as he neared the climax of his speech. "We are all architects of our own destiny," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "But we also have a duty to help those who have lost their way. To give a voice to the voiceless. To find those who are lost." The irony was a physical blow. Ilara felt a surge of rage so pure, it almost buckled her knees. She took a deep, steadying breath. "Not yet. Wait for the moment." Marcus raised a glass. "So I ask you to join me in a toast. To the future, to progress, and to the memory of those we've lost along the way, whose spirit inspires us to be better, to do more." He paused, his face a perfect portrait of solemn remembrance. "I'd like to dedicate this evening to the memory of my dearest friend, a man whose adventurous spirit was an inspiration to us all. My brother, Julian Vance." A wave of murmurs, of sympathetic sighs, rippled through the crowd. This was his masterstroke, using Julian's ghost as the final emotional flourish for his own beatificatio.now.elara. Single quotes as thumbs swiped across the screen of her phone. She hit play. For a second, nothing happened. Then, from the hidden speaker, a hiss of static filled the ballroom. The chatter died down. Heads turned, confused. Marcus faltered at the podium, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Assuming a technical glitch. And then, Hector's voice, thin and terrified, echoed through the vast, silent room. "Don't understand, you said he was just leaving?" Marcus froze. The blood drained from his face. The color vanished from his lips. He looked out at the sea of faces, his eyes wide with a dawning animal terror. He knew that voice. Then, his own voice, younger, colder, and utterly damning, filled the air. "I said I was handling it, and I am. The arrangement has changed." The confusion in the room curdled into shock. People were looking at each other, then at the pale, frozen figure on the stage. This wasn't part of the speech. He's a liability. The recorded voice of Marcus Reyes continued, booming through the ballroom. He was going to talk. He found out about the offshore accounts. He thought we were partners. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The air crackled with scandal. This was no technical glitch. This was a detonation. And then came the sound that shattered the universe. Julian's voice. "Marcus, no, don't do this, please." Alara watched as a woman in a diamond necklace dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor. The sound lost in the horror of the moment. "You always were too soft, Jules," the recording sneered. "Some of us are built to build empires. Others are just collateral damage." The final thud, the silence, and then, the voice of Marcus Reyes, the final, damning confession. "Because the jungle is good at keeping secrets. And so are we." The recording ended. An absolute, deafening silence descended upon the ballroom. It was the silence of 1,000 minds processing an unthinkable horror. Every eye was on Marcus Reyes. The benevolent philanthropist had vanished. In his place stood a monster, stripped naked in the spotlight. His sins broadcast to the world. He stood there for an eternal second, his face a rictus of disbelief and fury. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching, hunting, and then his gaze landed on her, at the back of the room, the waitress. He saw past the wig, past the uniform. He saw her, Alara, his nemesis, his undoing. In that moment, their eyes locked across the ruined landscape of his life. His expression was not one of remorse. It was one of pure, undiluted hatred. He had been beaten, and he knew it. Then, chaos erupted. People were shouting, screaming, phones were out, recording live streaming his public execution. The first flash of a press camera went off, then another, and another. The room was filled with a strobing, merciless light. Two plainclothes detectives, who had been waiting in the wings after receiving an anonymous tip from Alara an hour earlier, along with the audio file, began moving toward the stage. Marcus didn't run. He simply stood there, convulsing with a silent, impotent rage. He had built his world so carefully, a fortress of lies and money and power, and it had all been brought down by a ghost on a speaker and a woman who refused to let him be forgotten. As the detectives reached the stage, he tore his eyes away from Alara and looked at the crowd, at the flashing cameras, at the ruins of his legacy. A strange guttural sound escaped his lips, a laugh, a sob, a scream. It was the sound of a king. Watching his kingdom burn, Alara didn't stay to watch them put the handcuffs on him. She didn't need to. Her job was done. She slipped out a side door, melting back into the anonymity of the city night. She walked through the streets of New York, the sounds of the city a distant hum. The weight that she had carried for 16 years, the suffocating burden of not knowing, was gone. In its place was a vast hollowed-out calm. It wasn't victory. It wasn't joy. It was just the end. Justice hadn't been a quiet, dignified affair in a courtroom. It had been a public spectacle of revenge, as loud and brutal as the crime itself. She hadn't just exposed a killer. She had immolated a legacy, turning his greatest moment of triumph into his ultimate, public humiliation. It was a shocking, explosive, and emotionally cathartic purge. The payback was complete. And as the first sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer and closer to the hotel, Alara finally allowed herself to weep. Not for the monster she had destroyed, but for the gentle, trusting brother who tonight could finally rest. The earth was cold and damp. Spring had not yet managed to chase the last of the winter chill from the ground. Alara knelt, her fingers tracing the freshly carved letters on the cool, grey granite dot. Julian Vance, 1977-2009, beloved brother, son, and friend, finally HOM for 16 years. This plot had been empty, a symbolic space marked by a simple wooden cross she had placed there herself. The funeral had been a hollow affair, a service for a ghost. Now, it was real. After Marcus's arrest, his confession had come in a torrent, a final, desperate attempt to control the narrative. He had led the authorities to the place, not deep in the jungle, as the lie had suggested, but in a desolate, unmarked patch of earth on the outskirts of Letitia, a piece of land his company had purchased the month before he and Julian had arrived. Julian hadn't been lost to the wild, he'd been buried in a shallow, anonymous grave. Another one of Marcus's secrets, bringing him home, had been the final, gut-wrenching chapter. The identification, the paperwork, the quiet, sterile journey. Across continents, Alara had overseen it all, a final act of sisterly duty. Now, he was here, in the small cemetery behind the church where they had been baptized, resting beside their mother, who had died 5 years earlier, never knowing the truth. Her heart broken by a grief that had no end. The emotional aftermath wasn't a triumphant parade. It was a quiet, lingering echo. The trial had been a media circus, a feast for the scandal-hungry. Marcus Reyes, the fallen titan, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Hector Vargas, for his testimony, received a reduced sentence for his role as an accessory. The world saw justice served. But for Alara, it was more complicated. The rage that had fueled her for so long had burned itself out, leaving behind a profound, aching sadness. She had won. She had avenged her brother. But it wouldn't bring him back. It wouldn't erase the 16 years of stolen time, of unanswered questions, of a family hollowed out by a lie. She placed a small, smooth white stone on top of the grave marker. A stone she had carried in her pocket since she was a child, a twin to one she had given Julian. It was a simple, silent conversation with the brother, who was now only a memory. She thought of the cost of the truth. Hector's life, ruined. Her own life, irrevocably altered. She was no longer just a journalist. She was the woman who had taken down Marcus Reyes, a label that would follow her forever. She had seen the darkest parts of human nature, the greed, the cruelty, the bottomless capacity for betrayal. It had changed her, hardened her in ways she was only just beginning to understand. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree at the edge of the cemetery. The same kind of tree Marcus and Julian had climbed as boys. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a weak, watery light on the headstone. There was a bittersweet healing in this finality. The ghost was at peace. The questions were answered. The story had an ending. But it was a haunting one. She would forever be marked by the silence of those 16 years. She would forever see her brother's face, not as the laughing, vibrant man he had been, but as the terrified victim in his final moments. Justice had a price, and the currency was innocence. She had paid it in full. She stood up, her knees stiff from the cold ground. She looked at the name one last time, Julian Vance, not a ghost, not a myth, a man, her brother. She had given him back his name, his truth. It was the only thing she could do, as she walked away from the grave. Leaving him to the quiet company of their mother and the whispering leaves, she didn't feel victorious. She felt a profound sense of peace, but it was a peace etched with sorrow. It was the quiet, melancholic peace of a battlefield after the war is over. The fighting was done. The silence was absolute. And all that was left was to remember the fallen, and to carry the scars of the fight for the rest of her days. The echo of the explosion had faded, leaving a lingering, haunting hum that would be the soundtrack of her life forever.